Discover Geography, Lesson 6-2, Colonialism. In our last lesson, we looked at the existence of a great deal of economic inequality within our world. And we looked at some of the terminology we might use to describe the richer versus the poorer parts of the world. In this lesson, we're going to ask why that inequality is located where it is. Why is it that these particular countries constitute the developed world or the global north or whatever term we choose to use, and these other countries are the ones that are the third world or the periphery, or again, whatever terms we want to use. This question of why certain parts of the world are the rich ones and other particular parts are the poor ones is sometimes referred to as the question of the rise of the West. And this has been a major question addressed by the social sciences for over 150 years. Over the course of this time, there have been a number of theories that have been proposed that we can now discard, that we know do not explain why certain countries are the rich ones and certain are the poor ones. Race was a common theory for a long time. It was believed that people in the richer parts of the world, that is, white people, were more advanced, more evolved, smarter, and harder working than other races of people, and that's why their parts of the world are richer. If you recall our lesson on race, we know that there is in fact no biological distinction among races of people. There's no biological difference between distinct races of people, and therefore that can't be the basis of why some parts of the world have gotten rich and other parts have gotten poor. Another popular theory was that climate was responsible, that the rich parts of the world had the optimal climate for encouraging industry and growth, and other parts of the world had climates that made people lazy and ineffective. We can also discard that theory. There is no clear correlation between climate and economic development. The best theory we have to explain why certain parts of the world are rich and certain parts of the world are poor is what's called world systems theory. This is a theory that's based on the core versus periphery model of the global economy. In short, world systems theory argues that the core got rich by exploiting the periphery. And it did this through a process of colonialism, through taking over parts of the periphery and reorganizing their economies to serve the needs of the core rather than to serve their own needs. In order to understand the impact that colonialism has had on the world, we need to go back to the year 1200. At this point in time, China and India were the core of the world economy. Before we go on, I want to make a short detour to talk about dates. You see that I labeled the year 1200 CE. That refers to the year 1200 of the Common Era. Now that's the same as the year 1200 AD. So our dating system is based on an estimate of when Jesus was born. And so when we say dates are AD, that stands for Anno Domini, which is Latin for in the year of our Lord. Then dates BC stands for before Christ. Now, one of the problems with that is that our dating system was established by medieval monks who looked at the historical records available to them and the clues that are given in the Bible to try to estimate what year Jesus had been born. But their records were not particularly accurate. Modern history has been able to calculate that as best we can tell, because many of the references in the Bible that give an indication of dating are obscure and hard to pin down, but the best estimate we have right now is that Jesus was most likely born in the year that we would call 4 BC, 4 years earlier than those medieval monks thought that he was. So now we could add 4 years to all of our AD dates to make them correct. We could say that as of now, this is no longer 2014, it's now 2018 AD. But that would be a giant pain. What's easier is to stick with the numbers that we're used to. Stick with the numbers on the years, but change the names. Refer to them as the Common Era and before the Common Era. So the Common Era essentially is the dates that we're used to that are based on a mistaken estimate of when Jesus was born, and then before Common Era, before the dates that we're used to. So you'll see me using the terms CE and BCE throughout this course rather than AD and BC. So going back to 1200 of the Common Era, at this point in time, China and India were the core of the Eastern Hemisphere world economy. The economies of the Eastern Hemisphere were not really connected into the Western Hemisphere yet. No explorers had crossed that gap since the time when the ancestors of the Native Americans arrived in the Americas some 25 to 15,000 years earlier. So at this point in time, China and India were the richest, most prosperous countries in the world. They were the center of a set of trade networks that linked them from Japan to Zimbabwe to England. And at this point in time, Europe was kind of an economic backwater. Europe was on the periphery of this Eastern Hemisphere world economy. But Europe was connected in enough to know that there were these rich countries out there, that far away to the east were people with much greater wealth than Europe had at this point. And so Europe wanted in on that. Europe wanted to access this wealth that they saw in China and India. However, they had two problems. First, they didn't have many goods that China or India would want to buy from them. So Europe could manufacture metal goods, but China and India could make better metal goods. Europe could manufacture ceramics, but China and India could make better ceramics. Europe could make textiles, but China and India could make better textiles. So there wasn't a lot that Europe had to trade with China and India. Second, it was really tough to get from Europe to China or India. There's a lot of land blocking the way for any ship that wanted to try to sail over. Any European traders wanting to go to China or India would have to contend with the rulers of the Middle Eastern countries, who were often very hostile to Europeans as a result of a long period of religious conflict between those areas. So it was very difficult for European traders to get to China and India. In 1492, a man named Christopher Columbus set out to solve that second problem, to find an easier way to get from Europe to China. And he decided to do it by sailing westward from Europe around the other side of the world to China. The popular story that you've probably heard was that everyone in Europe thought Columbus was crazy because they believed the world was flat, and that if he sailed off westward, he'd fall off the edge of the earth, he'd never make it to China. That story is a legend that was invented in the 1800s. In fact, in Europe in the 1400s, every educated person knew that the world was round, and every sailor knew that the world was round. Educated people had known that the world was round since the time of the ancient Greeks. The ancient Greeks managed to not only confirm the roundness of the earth, but actually accurately estimate its size based only on measurements taken on the angle of the sun in different parts of Egypt. And so on this basis, people in Europe knew that the world was round, and they also knew that the world was very big. And so if you were to have set off sailing westward from Europe in the sailing ships available at the time, and if you hit nothing but ocean on your way to China, you would not have made it all the way. You would not have been able to sail that entire distance. And that's why no one else before Columbus had attempted to sail westward. They knew the world was round, but they also knew it was too big to reach China. Columbus launched his voyage on the basis of a mistaken idea about the world's geography. He had gotten a hold of a series of maps that showed the world as being much smaller than it really is. You see on the slide there one of his maps with the outline of the actual Americas superimposed on it. So Columbus believed that the distance from Europe to China, sailing westward, was about the distance that it actually is from Europe to the Americas. So he believed on the basis of this inaccurate map that he would in fact be able to make it to China, sailing westward. Now, luckily for him, there isn't just ocean between Europe and China. Luckily for him, there were other lands that he bumped into so that he didn't die at sea pursuing this mistaken idea of the world's geography. Once Columbus returned to Europe, and therefore the people in Europe became aware of the existence of what eventually was figured out to be two entire continents that they hadn't known about, This proved to be the boost that Europe was going to need in order to claim core status in the world economy, to displace India and China from their economic power. The important European countries then began to colonize the Americas. They began to take over land within the Americas and reorganize its economy in order to serve Europe's needs, rather than to serve the needs of the people who were living there in the first place. And you can see on this map the expansion of European colonial empires primarily into the Americas through the 15, 16, and 1700s. The Europeans were able to take over the Americas and were able to exploit American resources for their own economic benefit, in large part because of diseases that were brought by the European explorers and conquerors. You see here in this picture people in the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan dying of a disease that we think was probably measles. When the Spanish conquistadors made their initial assault on Tenochtitlan, they were turned back. Despite the technological advantages that the Spanish had in terms of guns and horses and steel for armor and swords, they were no match for the Aztec army at the height of its power. After that first initial unsuccessful assault, the Spanish fell back to regroup, to come up with a new strategy, and during that time that they were regrouping, the Aztec capital was hit with a disease outbreak. Their warriors had caught diseases from the Europeans, and these diseases were devastating to the Aztecs. So when the Spanish made their second assault, they were able to conquer the Aztec capital and bring down one of the major political powers of the Americas. And the same pattern was repeated all around the Western Hemisphere, that the European takeover of these lands was facilitated by the fact that disease epidemics killed huge numbers of the native people. In some tribes, as many as 95% of the people died of outbreaks of diseases like smallpox, measles, mumps, influenza, and even certain varieties of the common cold. On the other hand, the Europeans did not pick up any major diseases from the Native Americans, with the possible exception of syphilis. So it was a largely one-way transfer of disease that constituted an enormous military advantage for the European powers in taking over and colonizing the Americas. And there are basically three reasons why the Europeans brought over these devastating diseases but did not receive any devastating diseases in return from Native Americans. The first is that the Europeans had lots of livestock. Most of the major epidemic diseases that humanity has suffered started out as livestock diseases. They started out as diseases in cattle or sheep or pigs or chickens. The Europeans had had all of these kinds of livestock for thousands and thousands of years. They were a major part of the European way of life, as well as the ways of life of people in Asia and Africa that they were connected to through trade and migration. Native Americans, on the other hand, did not have this kind of livestock. There were only a few domesticated animals that Native Americans had: dogs, turkeys, guinea pigs, and llamas, essentially. So the Native Americans didn't have this reservoir of potential diseases that could jump the species barrier and become major human epidemics. Second, the Europeans came from a much larger population. Not only the overall population of Europe was fairly large at this time, but they were connected to the larger populations in Asia and Africa. This provided a large source of potential victims for these diseases. That meant that a disease could come into a certain area, it could infect a lot of people, and then as those people either died or got better, the disease could move on to another place and infect some more people. And by the time the disease eventually circled back around to that first population, there were a lot of new children that had been born who would now be susceptible to the disease again. So a large population can sustain an epidemic disease for a long time. A small population, which would be characteristic of most Native American societies, can't sustain an epidemic disease for that long. It will end up killing off everybody and then having nowhere to go, and so then the disease will die out as well. So the large population of the Eastern Hemisphere helped to maintain the existence of these diseases. The third advantage that the Europeans had was time. The Europeans had been exposed to these diseases for centuries, if not millennia. They were used to these diseases and they had evolved resistance to them. When a disease hits a population for the first time, there will be many people who are very susceptible to it. There will be many people who die from it. The people who survive will tend to be people who had some sort of bit of resistance to that disease. Through some sort of genetic quirk, they were a little less susceptible to that disease. And since they survive, and the more susceptible people didn't, it's the survivor's genes, the genes that confer resistance to this disease, that get passed on to the next generation. And so the next generation will not be as susceptible to that disease when it comes around again. And likewise for the next and the next and the next generation. And so over hundreds of generations, Europeans had evolved resistance to these diseases. They were diseases that were now often common childhood maladies, and they were no fun to have, but they weren't ones that necessarily killed people on an enormous scale. The Native Americans, on the other hand, had never experienced these diseases before. They'd never had any reason to evolve any resistance to them. And so the initial outbreaks of these diseases were absolutely devastating to native populations. Taking over the Americas gave European countries access to huge amounts of American resources. They were able to exploit the Americas as cheap sources of inputs to boost their economy. So throughout the Americas, agricultural products became essential. You see in this picture a sugar plantation on Haiti, when we have people processing sugarcane into sugar. That was a major commodity coming out of the American colonies for European consumption. And one of the most important resources that the Europeans were able to extract from the Americas was silver. Silver was the number one thing that China wanted in trade for all of its other products. And so Europe managed to stumble across, through geographic proximity, an enormous source of silver, principally in Peru and Mexico. There were enormous silver mines that the Europeans were able to use and then trade that silver eastward towards China and India, the core of the old world economy. So with this enormous input of resources from the Americas, European countries' economies were enormously boosted. They got a big jump start out of all of these resources that they were able to extract from their new American colonies that they had stumbled across and managed to take over as a result of the effects of disease. Now, since disease had killed so many of the native people of the Americas, Europeans needed to look elsewhere for workers. And so they ended up looking to Africa. In 1492, Africa's level of economic development was comparable to Europe's. Africa was not any poorer than Europe at this time. Africa was just as engaged in trade with the rest of the Eastern Hemisphere as Europe was. But Europe happened to be the place that was able to discover and colonize the Americas first. And so then Europe turned to Africa as a source of slave labor. The wealth that was coming into Europe from their American colonies allowed them to expand the slave trade. So slavery had existed in Europe and Africa for a very long time. But the enormous demand for slave labor in the Americas and the access to the wealth to pay for it from the American colonies increased the scale of the slave trade far beyond anything that had been seen before. And this expansion of the slave trade dealt a major blow to the economies of Africa. Slave trading became the most lucrative activity that people in Africa could engage in. One of the best ways to get rich was to capture your neighbors and to sell them into slavery to Europeans. You could get enormous amounts of goods in exchange for that. And so Africa began to experience a system in which everyone was trying to enslave everyone else, because if you enslave your neighbors first, they can't enslave you. This created a great deterioration in trust among people and in productive relationships between villages, between countries, between tribes within Africa. At the same time, the slave trade was removing Africa's most productive workers. the highest value slaves that you can get are young, able-bodied men and women. But those are also the people that are going to be the foundation of a country's economy. And so Africa was ending up losing its most important workers to the slave trade, and then in turn becoming dependent on imported European goods that were coming in exchange for these slaves as their economic base. So the slave trade undermined African economies. Africa went from being equally prosperous to Europe before the slave trade into being far poorer and more economically dependent by the end of the slave trading era. The slave trade continued for almost 4 centuries. Slavery has only been ended on a large scale. It still goes on a smaller scale in many parts of the world, including Africa, but the transatlantic slave trade has only been ended for about a century and a half. So the impacts of slavery are still visible on Africa today. Those parts of Africa that lost the largest number of people to slavery are still the areas of Africa with the worst economic prospects. Now, eventually, Europe's economy was boosted enough that they began to turn their attentions to the rest of the Eastern Hemisphere. European powers began to take over areas in Africa and Asia and turn them into colonies as well. Now, at this time, many of their former colonies in the Americas were gaining independence. And so Europe looked to Africa and Asia as sources of colonies to do essentially the same thing as the American colonies had done, to funnel wealth towards Europe as places that they could extract profit from. And by turning their attentions to Asia, Europe was now ready to take on their competitors in China and India, to knock those countries out of their position as part of the core of the world economy. And we can generally date the transition from India and China being the core of the world economy over to Europe being the core of the world economy, as well as European-derived societies like the United States, where there's a very high level of European immigration to settle there. That transition occurred about the year 1800. So it wasn't until just about 200 years ago that Europe finally made it to the status of being the core of the world economy. In India, Britain took over India and transformed it into a colony in the same way they did with their possessions in the Americas and in Africa and in other parts of Asia. The British conquered India and proceeded to rearrange India's economy to benefit Britain rather than to benefit the people of India. So, for example, one of India's major industries, one of the things that had helped it generate profits and become a core of the world economy, was textile manufacturing. Now, Britain also wanted to get into the textile manufacturing business. So what they did was they banned India from exporting textiles. They used their power over India to basically shut out their competition. Because of the effects of this colonialism, India suffered a dramatic decline in its economic fortunes. It went from being one of the richest parts of the world to being one of the poor parts of the world over the course of 200 years of British colonialism. The result of British colonialism in India was widespread poverty and even famine, as India's products were siphoned off to fuel Britain's economic development, with little left to support the lives of people in India. In China, a somewhat similar process happened. No European country ever conquered China and officially ruled China, but they didn't need to. In the case of China, as well as a few other parts of the world that were never officially conquered by any European country, Europe used its military and economic power that had derived from its colonial empires elsewhere in the world, to strong-arm China into a series of unfavorable trade deals. China was forced to open itself up to European imports while being banned from making equivalent exports to Europe. In this way, Europe was able to make profits off of China while undermining China's economy. And China was forced into these bad trade deals through European military might. You see in this picture a French force attacking the Chinese army in retaliation against Chinese resistance to a new trade deal that would have given France better terms and would have disadvantaged China even more. So through this process, even without formally colonizing China, even without conquering China, Europe was able to undermine China's economy and to force China into a peripheral position in the world economy. So China, like India, saw a dramatic drop in its standard of living, a dramatic drop in its wealth level during the era of European colonialism. In Africa, colonialism continued the process of impoverishment that had begun with the slave trade. In Africa, European colonial powers took over all of the best land to use for their own plantations, to grow crops for export to Europe, to grow crops to fuel European industry. African farmers were forced into this cash crop system through taxation and through outright violent coercion. The end result of this was that Europe gained a huge profit off of Africa, while the fortunes of the African people were greatly reduced. People in Africa had less access to land and less ability to support themselves as a result of the rules that were imposed by the various colonial powers that took over different parts of Africa. And in a kind of ironic twist, the effects of colonialism ended up being used as a justification for it. So as Africans were excluded from the best land within their countries, they were forced onto more marginable, less suitable land. On this land, they of course had much more trouble making ends meet. And they often engaged in practices which degraded that land because there was no other way to survive on the limited, low-quality land that was left to them by European colonialism. The Europeans took a look at that situation and decided that that meant that the African people were bad at taking care of themselves, were destroying their own land, and therefore needed European control over their country to set things right. So the effects of colonialism, the destruction that colonialism was causing to Africa, ended up being used in a twisted way as a justification for continued colonialism. Meanwhile, the wealth from these colonial empires is accumulating to Europe and begins to fuel the rise of European industry. So the economic growth of the West, the economic growth of Europe and heavily European-derived societies like the United States and Canada ends up being built heavily on the wealth extracted from colonialism.